would like to take the opportunity to address a serious topic here before I get going. Due to recent regulatory changes, I've updated my privacy policy that I'd like to let everyone know this, right? You can come read it. And before we proceed, you all must accept these cookies. Does everyone accept these cookies? Thank you. The internet, you've accepted them. Congratulations, you are GDPR compliant. I don't think that's how it works. Anyways, we're here to talk about logging, monitoring, and alerting in AWS today. And I've been speaking about this for a little while, and I have a lot of in-depth information, but what I wanted to provide is essentially a too long didn't read version of what we should be looking at. There's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of things to know about, and there's a lot to take away. And I don't want to send you guys home, you folks home with an additional year's worth of homework. So hopefully there are some takeaways from here that you can immediately apply and implement. So here's kind of the why me. I don't think it really matters about me or what I've done, but why am I here and why am I in a position to talk to you about AWS and best practices and logging, monitoring, alerting as it relates to IR. So I've spent an inordinate amount of time researching AWS. I helped build our incident response service line, and it was about 2 or 3 years of just pouring through the AWS documentation. Anyone that keeps up with this sort of stuff, you know that literally every single day, Amazon is coming out with something new or a change to an existing thing with a different name that you have to constantly keep up with. So I want to take this opportunity to consolidate my years of research so that you don't have to go and do the same and say, how do I even get started in this thing? What are these main things that I need to look at? Right? Just tell me what is this condensed version of 30 minutes and what can I take away to do? So here's the agenda. Always starts with the AWS security model because it is very critical to understanding the delineation and security there. And surprise, surprise, logging, monitoring, and alerting is on the agenda. I have left some time in for softball questions. If we could queue those up, those would be much appreciated. Is this anyone here? Why they moved to AWS? This is how it works, right? Just take our responsibility and just offload it to someone else because this is super easy, right? Anyone? This is how organizations work. Thank you for a few people being honest, right? So, not quite, right? There is a shared responsibility model. This is not a unilateral responsibility model, right? So AWS is responsible for security of the cloud, the bare metal stuff that they provide, the storage that they provide, the back end essentially of the services they provide, but you are responsible for everything above this line. So you're responsible for security in the cloud, and there is a distinct difference. Surprise, surprise, you are responsible for it, right? Securing your data, all your applications that you build, everything that you design and construct and configure in there, you are responsible for. And this is critical, right? I usually make everyone repeat this in the audience, and it's extremely uncomfortable, and I'm gonna make a game time decision on whether I do this right now. No, I made you guys do it last year, so I'll skip this. These are the main log sources we're gonna be looking at. So today's focus is CloudTrail, CloudWatch, VPC, S3, and we're also gonna throw in config, which is a pretty useful thing. Yes, there are other log sources. Yes, there's ELB and CloudFront and other things like that. But they're not really what I would consider the core critical of what pretty much everyone is going to be able to use. So instead, I'd like to focus on these main 5 that we'll talk about today. So starting with CloudTrail, if anyone is new to AWS or starting in AWS and what is this, we hear about this a lot, this is probably the thing you're going to hear the most about in AWS, CloudTrail. This is essentially your syslog on steroids. Due to recent developments in AWS, they are available for 90 days by default. They didn't used to be, but they've done you a favor in enabling those. So worst case, those should at least have 90 days worth of logs for you to go back and do something should you identify an incident. And there's a couple pain points here, as there are with a few AWS services. Each region's logs are kept only in that region's bucket by default. So if you are operating out of, say, US East 1, and you've enabled CloudTrail logs, and something happens in your account. You say, okay, great, I'm going to search through, I go to the bucket where the CloudTrail is in US East 1, and I search through it, and there's only one instance of this activity happening. Yes, in US East 1. But for the 11 other regions, you don't know, because those logs aren't stored in that bucket. It's very inconvenient. But there is one change in configuration you can do that will pay you back in spades, and also myself, if I'm doing the incident response, or any of you all, if you're doing the incident response, and that is configuring apply trail to all regions. This will, by default, collect all of the regions into one bucket, so that when you're doing these searches in the future, all you do is search through a single bucket's logs, and you have access to all of what's happening across the different regions. This is probably the most important point from this presentation. If you take nothing else away, it's to click Apply Trail to all regions whenever you see that. That is going to be your key to success there for global logging. CloudWatch, this is essentially performance metrics on your systems. These are enabled by default. They're sent every 15 minutes. If you do detailed monitoring, they'll send it every 1 minute. Okay? They can be useful in a sense, but more importantly, CloudWatch can be configured to also monitor your instances. And for those who are new, AWS instances is essentially your systems. It's the virtual machine that you're using. They term it instances. So CloudWatch logs can be configured to monitor your instances at a host level, which can be super convenient. Config is essentially tracking resource compliance against a set of rules. So config, short for configuration, it's probably not a long leap to understand that. This is easily set up by the console or command line. And this delivers logs to a SNS topic, which is essentially something that can send alerts for emails, or if you're using a Slack client, can integrate an API for notifications. Simple notification service is what it stands for. And a nice relatively recent development is that now this has multi-region data aggregation. So remember we talked about CloudTrail initially only logged to a single region, but you could apply it to all to consolidate it. Config now has that capability. So as you may be picking up, certain services by default are limited to a certain region, which is something you've always got to keep in mind as you go through and configure your accounts. Bonus, if you configure the agent on all of your host endpoints, you can also use CloudWatch as essentially a poor man's software inventory recording system and changes, to where if something's installed or updated or changed, this can then be sent to CloudWatch for your logging and alerting on, which can be super useful sometimes. So S3. S3 is the main storage service for AWS. Highly recommend you configure these several things for any S3 bucket you're using. MFA delete, multi-factor authentication delete. So this prevents some attacker from getting in there and stealing someone's credentials and just going and deleting all the logs. Because as an attacker, that's the first thing I would do. I get into an account, I'm going to go into CloudTrail, I'm going to delete every single log I can possibly find. That requires multi-factor authentication for someone to authenticate so that someone can't just blindly go through and do all that sort of stuff. Bucket level logging, which they call, it's essentially management level logging, which is really high level logging of this bucket was created, this bucket was deleted, very few things that it's actually useful for, enabled by default. But the object level data logging is not enabled by default. So to put this into an example, we've had customers come to us and say, we think data was accessed or taken from an S3 bucket. And we say, okay, great, give us all the logs. And we get a bunch of CloudTrail logs that show bucket created, bucket deleted, bucket created, bucket deleted. And we're like, that's great. But you didn't have data event logging to show if any of the data was accessed, right? This is a huge oversight. This is absolutely critical for anything that resides in the bucket to show what was put in there, what was taken out of there. If you're creating things, if you're removing things, if you're moving things around, absolutely critical. You want to enable this. Server access logs are also a possibility to be enabled, and they're essentially like Apache-ish logs. So if you like Apache logs, or if you hate Apache logs, these are Apache logs. They can be useful. Again, these are the major things that I would focus on for S3 configurations. VPC Flow Logs, these are essentially NetFlow logs. If you've seen NetFlow, you will be right at home with VPC Flow Logs. These can be enabled for either the entire VPC, which is essentially what you could consider like a VLAN equivalent in on-premise. A subnet or an elastic network interface, which is essentially just a network interface. So it can be looking solely at a specific machine's equivalent of a NIC all the way up to an entire VLAN. I highly recommend enabling this for anything you remotely care about. Storage is cheap-ish in AWS, and these can provide a massive amount of valuable data, especially when doing incident response. And this is the beautiful thing about AWS, because if you have an on-premise environment and you say, oh, I want to enable NetFlow logging today for this VLAN we have, how long would it take you guys to do that? I mean, the average person, a day, 3 days, a week, 6 months to buy an appliance and suffer through vendor stuff, right? This is literally a click of a button. You go to the VPC and you go, enable VPC Flow Logs, and they automatically start going. Absolutely awesome. Each of these are logged to CloudWatch Logs as a separate log group in a different stream, and you can create metrics and filters for these. And we'll get into these specific metrics and filters later on in the presentation. But you can do things such as anything you would do with NetFlow data. Look for brute force RDP or SSH attempts, right? You can look for known malicious traffic to IPs or large outbound data transfers. So that was the logging setup config of those 4 to 5 main areas, right? So what's the TLDR of this? So how do I enable these, right? CloudTrail and CloudWatch are enabled by default, with the exceptions of the few configuration things that I said to kind of go and poke and ingest. These absolutely should be configured by you. How do you centralize them, though? So CloudTrail, if we go through and we configure it and we can apply it to all regions, you have all of your CloudTrail logs essentially stored in one bucket that you can look for, which is amazing. Stored in a single S3 bucket for easy searching. That's the easy way to do it. When things are sent to CloudWatch, it is actually considered a separate log area, and that can require a kind of convoluted setup for centralization, sending to a thing called Kinesis streams, which sends it to this whole stream source, and then you use AWS Lambda functions to kind of send them wherever else you'd like. You don't have to know about that right now, but just keep that in reference for the future when you get down the road and you get to CloudWatch stuff and you're like, how do I centralize these at all? Because there's no button to just click and do that. And how should I configure them? I gave you some tips and tricks, but really, you need to go read the docs. You really got to understand how your business works and really what you need to focus on. Those are the core stuff that I would say at minimum you should have configured, but those aren't the end, right? So this should get you started and at least have something you can take home and say, this is what we need to be doing right now, and this is exactly how we need to configure stuff. And we can figure the rest out, the intricacies as we go down, but we've got the core requirements. So for monitoring and alerting, so we've got the logging covered. So how do I configure and set up logging so I have all the right stuff coming, and where do I configure it to send it? So what about monitoring and alerting? So we have the logs now and they're coming in. So how do we monitor and alert on them? Generally, this is how the stuff breaks down for the APIs. Gets and lists can indicate enumeration or recon. Describes, lists, lookups, same sort of thing for data collection if an attacker is in there. If you start seeing a bunch of these in logs from a singular instance of API calls to get for your entire infrastructure, or describe that sort of stuff, that could be indicative of an attacker going and enumerating and doing a recon. Delete, disable, remove. AWS has conveniently built their API to have these sort of prefixes for a lot of different services. So for whatever service you have, there is a lot of get whatever to do a bunch of reads. And for other services, there's a lot of describe to do specific descriptions of the configurations. And then for if you want to delete stuff, it's typically delete something. It's super convenient. So this is typically how they break down to kind of give you an overview of, in general, what might these API calls look like and what would I want to monitor for different areas of focus. So log tampering, resource creation, modification, deletion. This is a kind of a high-level overview. So what services and logs should I monitor specifically? Well, all of these, I would say, which is kind of most of the major ones. And how should I do it? So what tools can I use to monitor and alert? And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, for those that are staged to AWS, they give you a lot of tools to do a lot of this yourself. So simply using native tools, I would say this is what I would term the quadfecta of monitoring and alerting using native tools. Config, CloudTrail, CloudWatch, and Lambda, you can pretty much do almost everything you'd want to do for monitoring and alerting with those 4 services. And supporting tools, Trusted Advisor, that kind of gives you a breakdown of things that AWS is looking at in your account for these basic checks that are saying, you probably shouldn't have this. This is an alert you might want to look at. This is kind of configured this way. You might want to check that out. Kind of their pro bono thing for, there's a free tier and there's a paid tier, obviously. But and there's guard duty, if anyone has heard of that. That's a relatively newish service, and that automatically monitors your VPC Flow Logs, which are NetFlow, right? Your CloudTrail logs and DNS logs, even if you don't have DNS configured, right? So this is kind of awesome as your first step toward monitoring and alerting. You may want to check this out. But of course, it's region limited, right? So remember I said earlier, some of these services, or a lot of these services, are region limited to begin with, so you got to keep an eye out for these. So the upside is this logs to CloudWatch. So you can do some kind of CloudWatch-y things to get them centralized, as I hit on a little bit earlier, and we'll get into a little bit later. Another caveat is only analyzes CloudTrail management events, which are higher level, like resource created, resource deleted, configuration change sort of stuff. If you want to be monitoring things like we hit on for S3 bucket object access logging for objects created, deleted, that sort of stuff, this is not going to do it. You have to set that up yourself. So that's a kind of important caveat. Here's kind of an example of native monitoring and alerting infrastructure. This is just taken straight from Amazon's answers segment of their setup. So this is kind of how you might expect a native setup to look. And this kind of thing can be super powerful and can pretty much get you to the last 80, 90% of what you might want to do. So how about specific examples for monitoring and alerting? So CloudWatch alarms. CloudWatch has two things you can use for monitoring and alerting. It has alarms and events, and first we'll hit on alarms. So these are essentially basic notifications for certain sorts of things. So for billing, I would suggest setting up an alarm when a certain threshold is reached, because it's not just important for managing costs, but remember, everything in AWS essentially costs something, right? It's cost based on usage. So if an attacker's in there, they're spinning up a bunch of instances and they're doing a bunch of stuff, it's likely going to incur some costs. So if you have some general understanding of your baseline of what it should and shouldn't hit, there should be an alarm in there that says, if this ever reaches this level or this thing, just send me notifications so I can check it out. You might be surprised at how many incidents you can catch by just looking at billing alerts. System logs. So you can create alarms for system logs that you may be monitoring with CloudWatch. So you can create a metric and alarm on any RDP connections or even maybe PS exec being run on systems. This is really powerful stuff. You can create an alarm for any instance being stopped, terminated, rebooted, or recovered. And you can use flow logs to monitor for network traffic spikes and C2 activity with CloudWatch alarms. So you can set up an alarm and say, if there's a spike in network traffic, maybe you want to set it up and say, network traffic shouldn't spike at these hours of the day, maybe at night or something like that. I want an alarm if there's ever high usage of network traffic at night. Or if I have particular malicious IP addresses that I want to look for, I can set up alarms and say, if you ever see this, send me an alarm, send me a notification, let me know what's going on. So CloudWatch events are a little bit different than alarms. They're not just a notification. They're to perform actions in response to certain things that happen. So you can send yourself an alarm when something happens, but you might want to do something in response to that action. And this is where CloudWatch events come in. So running through a bunch of the major services, how can we use CloudWatch events to really monitor and alert on those things? So for CloudTrail, if you're sending logs to them, you might want to perform some reaction if you see a stop logging API or a delete trail API call made. So you may want to send a notification to the security team saying, hey, this happened. Remember, we did CloudWatch alarms, say, hey, this thing happened. Someone did a stop logging delete trail, which we shouldn't be having done. And then with an event, you can actually take that data and format it into an email and give them that data of who did it and where it came from and the source IP and all that sort of stuff. It can be really powerful. Say you have an unsupported instance type created. You can use a Lambda function, which is essentially a response code you run that's serverless, that just runs ad hoc in real time in response to certain events. So you can code in Node.js or JavaScript or Python or whatever, and you can say, oh, if there's an unsupported instance type, I want to create this function and say, whatever that instance type is, whatever that instance ID is, go and shut that down because that should never be created. I personally have some of these set up for our team where if someone spins up a massive GPU instance or something like that that's completely unnecessary for our line of work, it shuts it down. There's no reason to be having that sort of stuff running. using this to leverage force multiply for yourself. So you don't have to specifically respond to every one of these things. You can leverage CloudWatch Events to say, immediately do this until I get to it. So immediately shut it down, or immediately terminate, or immediately do whatever. If an instance is terminated, you can create a CloudWatch event to say, if anything is ever terminated, quickly grab some logs from it before you shut it down, right? How useful would it be to have some information from that system before it's completely blown away? Especially companies that are using auto-scaling, where they have thousands of instances spun up and spun down all the time, and we go and talk to them, that's preparing for incident response, blah, 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 and they're like, but we're using auto-scaling, like how would we ever get information from systems that are already terminated? Well, this is a great way to do that. Right, so set up some rules that before it's terminated, just collect some basic information. Maybe you want to collect some basic logging. Maybe you want to collect some certain metadata about the instance before it completely shuts down, so you have some insight into what was going on. So if an attacker spins it up and does something and shuts it down and terminates it, without this, you're not going to have the information. For guard duty, you could use CloudWatch events to just configure all those findings to be converted into an event and then monitor for these specific findings. So guard duty uses findings as basically it's each piece of information that it says, this is something that I found that's probably an alert, and you might want to do something to it. If a new user is created, maybe you want to disable the account until it's reviewed. Maybe you only want one person doing this, and maybe you say, I'm putting in an event that says, if an account is created by anyone other than this person, immediately disable that and need to review it. Or if there's gratuitous failed logins, you can send an email to yourself. You can block the IP immediately. Anything you put your mind to that you want to code in Python and use these libraries to do, it's pretty awesome. If there's log files deleted from an S3 bucket, you may want to respond and send a notification and compile that information into who did this delete request and send me an email with it because I want to know exactly when someone deletes stuff from a certain bucket. Or if a sensitive role is assumed, if you have this admin role that you're using for only a certain set of people to do stuff, you can create a Lambda function that says, whoever assumed this role that's not in this list, immediately disable their account because they should have never assumed a role into this and something is immediately wrong. Trusted advisor, I hit on a little bit earlier. Say you have unutilized or underutilized EC2 instances. If an instance is just sitting there running for 3 months, maybe you want these scripts running that say, if something's sitting for more than a week and no one's using it, shut it down, right? This can be great for billing and also just to reduce your attack surface as well. If you have an access key publicly exposed, respond immediately, delete the access key, and send an email notification. That can be super useful. There's a lot of S3 bucket negligence awards that are occurring in the news, and there's always someone's leaking a key and always someone is leaving a bucket wide open. So these are some great things to kind of address that and mitigate that. If a known malicious IP is seen in your VPC net flow logs, respond in a certain way. Run a command to capture memory on that system. Use a Lambda function to isolate that instance. If you see brute forcing, alarm with the offending IPs in a traffic summary. And if you see large outbound data transfers, perhaps you just want to be looking at these VPC flow logs and say, if there's any outbound connection that's sending way more data out than is coming in, that's a problem, right? We need to alert on that and say that's a possible data exfil attempt, and that needs to immediately be made known to us. How easy is this stuff to do on premises? It's not easy, right? You couldn't just take an on-premise network and say, well, I'm going to start capturing all NetFlow today, and then I'm going to create a rule that notifies me on any large outbound data transfer larger than X. Like, AWS becomes extremely powerful in this regard and allowing you to do so many things that you could not do before on premises. For configuration rules and changes, perhaps you want to send a notification request when anything changes. Perhaps you have a static environment. You want to say, if anything changes in here, I want to send an alert, and I want to trigger something. Or maybe every once in a while, I want to run validation that all of my accounts have multi-factor authentication enabled on them. And if someone's disabled them in the meantime, if I run a scan and that's disabled, their account's going to be disabled, and an email's going to be sent to them to say, hey, this is a problem. You need to re-enable this, and it won't be enabled until you respond back to this. You can run checks for unused IPs. If a user's created, the sky's the limit here. I mean, I can run through all these specific things, but this is essentially some key ways to be using the config service to be monitoring for resource changes, considering config is monitoring for these already. So that's a bunch of native tools, which pretty much cover the gamut. But there are third-party tools that do an awesome job as well. And I want to make sure I call those out. So here's a list. I'm not going to go into them. But this is probably a great core set of third-party tools if you're going to look into them for monitoring and alerting in AWS. These companies have not done anything starkly different than anyone else, except they've looked at AWS and they've lived in it long enough that they've said, I want to automate this sort of thing. I want to harness AWS resources better for our purposes. And so they put together these packages that use mostly just absolutely native AWS stuff. It's something you couldn't do yourself, but they've already put in the hard work for doing this sort of stuff. So I highly recommend checking these out as well. So what's the TLDR of this? Like, what should I be monitoring? Everything, essentially. And it's not that hard. It's hard to hear, yeah, monitor everything, and you're like, oh, great, like that's a big letdown. But as you can see, a lot of this stuff is just one click away. It's not that hard to configure. At least get it enabled and going. And at least you know there's both native and third-party tools. I ran through all the native tools, or most of the core native tools that you want to use for monitoring and alerting. It's a decent-sized list, but it's not impossible, right? In what order should I set up monitoring and alerting? So that's sometimes a difficult question to answer. And I started thinking about this, and I thought it's not really that dissimilar from setting up an actually useful threat intel program. So threat intel is a huge rage, and how do I set up a threat intel program? And I often see a lot of companies, they go and they say, well, what feeds can we buy? And we'll pay for all this external stuff and third-party tools and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that's necessarily the right way. I think the right way is to follow this sort of model at the bottom. So first, you've got to clearly define what you're going to monitor. You want to monitor everything or just certain things? Certain VPCs, certain critical areas, certain servers, identify that. Understand your existing valuable data, right? Your most valuable signatures are what you're seeing already. Like, those are signatures. You already have these. You have threat intel. You have signatures for data that you're going to monitor and alert on. Like, these exist in your environment. You've just got to look for it. So implement and exhaust your native tools. Number one, and this is what I recommend for anyone to do before they start looking at third-party stuff. There's so much you can do in AWS, and I provided kind of a small roadmap and core cutout of those that you really shouldn't even be considering third-party stuff until you've exhausted all those. And if you think you have exhausted native stuff, really go back and relook at this stuff, because there's a lot of data that you could easily miss. Only then should you really start looking at third-party tools and say, hey, I know what I've got, I know what I need to be monitoring, I'm doing everything I can, and if it's just a shortage of manpower, that's great, use a third-party tool, but you need to be in a position to say, I know I'm already doing the best that I can with native tools before I start looking at third-party setup. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.